Thank all of you for returning for part 2 of this 3-part series. And if this is your first time with us, welcome. We're very happy to have Pamela Morton back with us today. And just briefly, she's an artist and university teacher who has been living and working in the south of France for over 30 years. This is a thrill for us to be able to offer a program where she is actually teaching from France. So welcome back, Pamela, and enjoy the program.
Great. Thank you so much, Gloria. Okay, just give me a second and I'll pull up my slides. Well, welcome back for those of you who were with me last time. Last time we talked about Paul Cézanne, who's from the south of France, born in Aix and did most of his work in Aix and died in Aix. And today I want to talk about another artist who's associated with the south of France, and that is Vincent van Gogh. Vincent van Gogh, born in 1853. He's born in the southern part of Holland, southern Netherlands, close to the Belgian border. And he dies in France, just in a little town north of Paris called Auvers-sur-Oise. And look at the dates for him, 1853 to 1890. So he was only 37 years old when he died. So that's something to keep in mind. A short life and a short artistic career. Relatively speaking, he came late to painting. He only starts painting at the age 27. So think of that, a short artistic career of only 10 years. And I'm sure that when I say his name, and by the way, you'll notice that I say Vincent van Gogh. That's what I learned to say when I was in school in the States. The French like to think of him as a French artist, so they pronounce it as Van Gogh. And I can't do a good Dutch pronunciation. I don't know if any of you can, but maybe later on you can tell us how to do that. Fortunately, he realized that this was a problem, and he signed his works with his first name, Vincent, to simplify everything. Anyway, Vincent van Gogh comes from the north. Oh, I know what I was talking about. A 10-year career. And I'm sure when I say his name, certain paintings just come to mind immediately. Do they? I suppose you could just nod if they do. Maybe you think of the sunflowers, Starry Night. I see some nods. The bedroom. Okay, these are all paintings we're going to look at. But consider this. Short life, short artistic career, and the paintings we know best were the paintings he produced in Provence, in the south of France. And he's only in the south of France for 2 years. So right at the end of his life, 1888 to 1890. He dies in 1890. I have one photograph, but we don't have many photographs of Vincent van Gogh, but you can see him here over on the left at age 19. And I put this painting on the right to start with. This is a painting that no longer exists because it was destroyed in World War II. It was in a German museum, but that's not the reason why I chose it. I chose it because of the way he's represented himself. This is a kind of self-portrait. It's called The Painter on His Way to Work. And so we see Vincent van Gogh all kitted out with his knapsack and all the equipment he needs for working out of doors, going off into the countryside to try and find his motif, to decide what he wants to paint. And I like this painting also, not only because it shows him as a working artist, but because it tells us something about Vincent van Gogh that's very different from Cézanne. Cézanne, remember, he starts his career up in Paris, but really he spends most of his time down here in the south, in and around Aix-en-Provence. He was pretty much a backyard boy. A completely different story for Vincent van Gogh. Vincent van Gogh was someone continually on the move. And that's what we'll be seeing. And by the way, at one point, Vincent van Gogh preached, in the sermon he preached was called Pilgrim's Progress, based on John Bunyan's allegory, Christian allegory. And this poem sort of structured his life. His life for him was a journey, and a difficult journey, so a pilgrim's progress. And that's, again, why I chose this painting to start with. Okay, so let's start at the beginning. We know, of course, Vincent van Gogh as a painter, but did you know the first 7 years of his working life were spent as an art dealer? He goes to work at age 16. Okay, that's when he leaves school and goes to work. And he has an uncle on his father's side. In fact, he's got 3 members of the family who work in the art business. And he has an uncle named Vincent, they call him Cent for short, who runs a gallery in The Hague. And Vincent van Gogh goes to work for Uncle Cent in The Hague. Uncle Cent realizes that he's in competition with an important art dealership in Paris called Goupil, and he decides to merge. They form a kind of partnership, and Goupil becomes a very important art dealer in Europe. They have offices in The Hague, London, Paris, Brussels, New York. I think I'm forgetting something, Berlin, I guess. So this is quite an extensive affair. Vincent van Gogh, again, at age 16, goes to work for the gallery, and he works for about 5 years in The Hague. He's promoted, and he's sent to London, and then he's promoted again, Paris. And I say promoted with quotes because of the last couple of years as an art dealer became sort of difficult, okay? In fact, what happens is he starts to lose interest in the art business, not in art. But I wanted to start off with this because the fact that he worked for a gallery was very important. It was important because it taught him something about the art market, what people were interested in buying. Also, it exposed him to a wide range of art imagery. So once again, the photograph shows you the Paris office where he was at the end of the 7-year period. And over on the right, this is an illustration which shows you what the gallery would have looked like. I can't remember if this is the gallery in The Hague or in Paris, but look at the way they display the work. Just from the floor all the way up to the ceiling, the walls are covered. Vincent van Gogh was also interested in the fact that the gallery dealt not only in actual works of art, but in reproductions after works of art. In fact, this is how they made most of their money. And Vincent van Gogh used this to acquire a collection of prints that were offered through Goupil. And he had a huge collection that he put together from Goupil, but I have down here on the bottom 2 of his favorite works. The one is over on the left is by a Dutch artist. The title is Going to Church for the Last Time. And it actually refers to a funeral procession moving through a wheat field on their way to the church. And we see a farmer in his field here who's taken off his hat as the mourners go by. And in a way, this painting has a couple of things that are important to Vincent van Gogh. His deep respect for nature, his deep respect for rural life, and also a kind of concern with spiritual matters, with God, and certainly death. And by the way, this print also hung in his father's house, so he knew it growing up as well. Another print that was of held a special place in his collection of prints was the one you see on the right called Christ the Consoler. And this was kind of his religious view that religion should offer a kind of consolation to people. And so Christ the Consoler was also a print that he hung in his rooms. Well, I mentioned there was trouble. He enjoyed his work at The Hague. Apparently he did quite well. But then at the end of the 5 years, I think there was some concern that he was a little bit uncouth, and they didn't want to have him up front dealing with customers. So they sent him off to London, and London didn't have a gallery as such. So he was mostly involved with people who were involved with producing these prints after works of art. And then he's sent to Paris, and in Paris he has a kind of crisis, and he decides to leave the business. And his crisis was a kind of religious crisis. He became interested in reading the Bible, and he decides to shift gears. He actually trains. He does religious studies for a year, and he wanted to become a minister. At the end of the year, he changes again and decides to become a missionary. And he finally gets an appointment just over the border from Holland in Belgium, in an area called the Borinage. And this is a mining district. You can see my postcard on the right with the slag heap in the postcard. We see it also in these two very early sketches of Vincent van Gogh. So even though I say that his decision to become an artist at age 27, he does dabble a little bit in doing some drawings. And here are two drawings he does in the Borinage. As a missionary in this area, he's very moved by the lives of these miners, the difficult conditions. And Vincent van Gogh gets carried away. He gives away everything he has: the shirt off his back, the roof over his head, the money out of his pockets, the bread off his table. And the powers that be frown on this. He was known in the Borinage as the Christ of the coal mine, and he's dismissed after a year there. So here he is in the Borinage. Again, he feels this connection with the people. He wants to help them. He wants to console them. But being a minister hasn't worked out. He even tried his hand at teaching for a while in London. That didn't work out. And so he's thinking again about what to do. All this time, he's been in touch with his younger brother, 3 years younger, his brother Theo. And Theo says to Vincent van Gogh, well, why don't you think about developing your skills as an artist? And Vincent van Gogh thinks about this and decides, yes, this is a good idea. Theo, in the meantime, has followed in his elder brother's footsteps. He too went to work for Goupil and Company. And at this point now, he's in the Paris office. And in fact, this is where he stays. He has his career working for this art gallery in Paris. Vincent van Gogh says to Theo, he says, send me all the books that Goupil has on how to teach yourself how to draw, because this was another interest that the company had. And there was a book called A Drawing Class done by a man named Charles Bargue and published by Goupil. And do you know this book is still used today? And this book was something, for example, that Picasso studied. Anyway, most of the exercises are about, well, you can see some are about proportions, but most of them were how to draw based on classical works of art, Greco-Roman sculpture. And you can see that in the top two and also the bottom one on the right. And this is how Vincent van Gogh became an artist. He was virtually self-taught, and he followed the program set up by this book, which means that in a certain way, he had a kind of academic training, because that's the nature of the program presented in this book. When I say academic, I mean traditional establishment training. However, Vincent van Gogh, thinking about the things he saw in the gallery in Goupil, and especially there was a great interest in kind of paintings of the peasants, of rural life. Both there was a Dutch school of peasant painting and a French school of peasant painting. And Vincent van Gogh's, one of his top 10 favorite artists that he got to know was a French artist by the name of Millet. Millet did a painting, as you can see over on the left, called The Sower. And I think what Vincent van Gogh liked about this painting is it's a painting of the peasants, but it doesn't show the peasants being ridiculous. These are not caricatures. There's not drinking or flirting or falling down. There's a kind of biblical dignity in the works of Millet that Vincent van Gogh admired. And also look at the way Millet filled the canvas with this figure of the sower. So it was a very powerful work, making a powerful statement. And Vincent van Gogh returns to the work of Millet over and over throughout his life. He makes copies after Millet's work. This is a drawing that Vincent van Gogh did in 1881, based on the Millet painting. And here's a set of prints that Goupil developed of Millet's paintings, and that Van Gogh asked his brother specifically to send to him so that he could do copies after this. So this was his way of learning how to become an artist, was by copying, working from this textbook, and also copying things that he particularly liked, like these prints of the peasants and rural life. It so happened that Vincent van Gogh had a cousin through marriage who was a painter, part of the Dutch, what was called the Dutch Realist School. So again, an artist interested in rural life and the life of the peasants. And his name was Anton Mauve, who took Vincent van Gogh in for a while. And I've given you two examples of the type of work that Mauve did. And these were paintings that were in Mauve's studio when Vincent van Gogh arrived. Vincent van Gogh loved his work, and he's one of the artists that Vincent van Gogh mentions over and over again in letters to his brother Theo. And it was under Mauve that Vincent van Gogh first took up a paintbrush, because up to this point he had been doing drawings. And here is one of his very first, I do believe his first attempt in oils. And this was under the tutelage of Mauve. And it's a simple still life painting. Of course, Dutch art is particularly well known for still life. And look at the elements here in this still life. Very simple, homespun, homely objects. A pair of wooden shoes, some potatoes, a carrot, a cabbage. And look at even how Vincent van Gogh has positioned the cabbage. If it were the other way around, it might be sort of pretty, almost like a flower. But here he's got it upside down. And something else that I think is sort of typical. So in terms of this choice of subject matter, everyday, ordinary, simple, there's this interesting contrast between light and dark. And you can attribute that to his interest in another Dutch artist, Rembrandt, who also used a very dramatic light and dark contrast. But there does seem to be almost like this cabbage is set aglow from some kind of inner light. Vincent van Gogh's first idea was not to be a painter, but of course he starts off drawing, and he thought, what I want to be is an illustrator. While he was in London, he admired the illustrations he saw in the London newspapers. And these are two drawings he worked on in different studies, and that were eventually turned into lithographs, and that he was hoping that he could sell to some sort of journal or publication. And the titles he's given the works here, At Eternity's Gate and Sorrow, these were titles he gave in English. This is another talent of Vincent van Gogh. He was quite the linguist. He spoke Dutch, he learned English, he spoke French, and he also spoke German. And wherever he was, that was the language that he communicated in, even when he was dealing with his brother. When he was in France, he wrote his brother in French. Oh, okay. So here we are, just the beginning of his career. And again, if you compare these works with what he's doing later on, the works that he does in Provence, for example, Sunflowers, Starry Night, these are such a far cry. The paintings are dark, very dark, and in that way, kind of traditional. I'd like to talk to you a little bit about the circumstances in which these two paintings were produced. The one on the left shows his father's church. His father was a minister. He was part of this Calvinist movement, the Dutch Reformed Church, evangelical. And this was his father's church. His mother had hurt her leg and was sort of laid up. And so Vincent van Gogh did a painting of the church for his mother. And then the next year, his father died, and Vincent van Gogh went back to this painting, added the leaves on the trees, so gave it a kind of fall coloring, which you can see is symbolic because the father just died, and he added the figures who were dressed in mourning clothes. And that same year, just after his father's death, and a little bit like Cézanne, Vincent van Gogh had a tense relationship with his father. There were times where they got on. There were times where Vincent van Gogh left in a huff. There were times when the father threw him out of the house. Anyway, so it was a stormy relationship. And just after his father's death, he does the painting over on the right. This is his father's Bible. And you could see it's open. It's a big, hefty book, and especially big compared to the other little book. And the other little book in yellow is a Parisian paperback. And I don't know if you can make out the title, but written by Émile Zola, remember, who was Cézanne's best friend, boyhood friend, for 30 years until they're falling out. And the title on this book is Joie de vivre, the joy of life. So you can see what's happening with this painting. It's about him and his father, and maybe two different kind of takes on the world. His father's traditional take and his own take. So the Émile Zola book is his modern Bible. And even though his little paperback is much smaller than this enormous Bible, it competes because of the bright yellow coloring. So it's a strong color note in this otherwise very dark painting. Vincent van Gogh decides to become, quote, a peasant painter. And he has difficulties because he tries to recruit the local people to pose for him, but the local people always show up in their Sunday best, which is not what Vincent van Gogh wants. And at one point, the local minister becomes worried about Vincent van Gogh and having these people pose for him. And so nobody comes to pose for him anymore. They're worried, especially that when there are women who come to pose. Anyway, he does a series of the peasants. Here's a man working at a loom. Here's a woman digging. And this is a pencil sketch of a peasant woman in her cap. He does 50 paintings showing the heads of the peasants, and he uses these are serve. He puts them together in a kind of synthetic work. This is the only group portrait that Vincent van Gogh ever made. And of course, and you may know this painting because it's a famous painting and a painting that Vincent van Gogh himself was very proud of, called The Potato Eaters. He was proud of it because this was a real challenge for him, especially at this point in his career, to do one, it involves the figure, two, it's a group portrait, and the figures are in a kind of setting. And notice the faces here. They almost look like caricatures, but once again, different from a lot of earlier Dutch painting. There's nothing silly about these peasants. There's a kind of seriousness. And what Vincent van Gogh has exaggerated their features, made them sort of, given them bony hands and gnarly features. And Vincent van Gogh realized that this wasn't technically correct, but he said, this is the way I want it, because here there is a correspondence between what I'm painting and how I'm painting it. He said, these people are having a simple meal of potatoes and coffee. These are the potatoes they dug out of the earth with their own hands. And he actually described the way he worked on this painting. He compared himself to a farmer working in the fields, that the paint was like mud that he would drive through and layer up to sort of create these works. Notice the single light source here. And we have these figures too involved with coffee over here on the potatoes. There's a clock on the wall saying 7 o'clock. That would be meal time. And we have a young girl standing up. And of course, this is a way of bringing us into the painting. The only official art training that Vincent van Gogh had, not including the time he spent with his uncle. And by the way, his uncle too threw him out at one point. I think Vincent van Gogh was someone who was very intense, and he was very demanding. And I think a lot of people found that sort of tiring. And that seems to have been what happened between him and Anton Mauve. Anyway, he goes to Antwerp and he enrolls in the local art academy. And he does this because, number one, it's free, so he doesn't have to pay anything. Number two, it meant that he had access to models, which was always kind of a problem for him. And he could get some criticism. He could paint, as you could see, and draw from plaster casts. And also he could work on anatomy. Often schools had skeletons like you see on the right, but Vincent van Gogh's painting is sort of a juvenile joke because he's put a lit cigarette between the teeth of this skeleton that was probably hanging in the school. Vincent van Gogh didn't stay very long here, and he writes to his brother, he says, nobody's doing anything good. My work looks so different from what they're doing, and we'll see down the road, you know, who's doing something important and who's not. And it is true that he was and they weren't. Anyway, he leaves the school, and had he stuck around to get his what do I want to say, his score, his grade, he would have realized that he'd flunked. They put him back. But he didn't stick around for this. He left Antwerp in Belgium to go to Paris. He's in Paris where his brother was. His brother's working for Goupil. And like when Cézanne goes up to Paris and meets Zola, and they go off and they discover all the new things that are going on in art. Well, Cézanne was there, let's say, about 6-7 years before Vincent van Gogh. But Vincent van Gogh and Theo are also very excited about the new things going on in art, particularly Impressionism. And Theo has been writing Vincent about Impressionism, and Vincent decides, I can't wait any longer. I have to see what this is for myself. And he just shows up unannounced. He leaves a note on Theo's door and he says, I'm in the Louvre, come and find me. And here are two paintings he produces soon after arriving in Paris. And the one on the right is a kind of panoramic view of Montmartre. Montmartre was kind of a peripheral area, a sort of suburban area in a way, because there were still windmills and vineyards in this area. And of course, this is where a lot of artists lived and worked because it was cheaper. It was on the edges of Paris, and this is where Theo lived. So he does this view from Theo's apartment, and he does this wonderful painting over on the left. Such an interesting painting because of the choice of subject matter. This is a painting that you could say is a still life because there are inanimate objects, but it's also portraiture because these are shoes, well-worn shoes, shoes that have taken on something of the personality of their wearer. And I will say that Vincent van Gogh virtually walks to Paris from Antwerp. It took him quite a while, but he manages to arrive basically on foot. Well, okay, see the difference between the shoes and the panoramic view? And, I went too fast. This painting here, suddenly color. Vincent van Gogh is in Paris. His brother knows many of the Impressionists because his brother's living in Montmartre. Also, his brother's involved with art, interested in the avant-garde, all the new things that are going on in art. And his brother works in a gallery. So his brother is able to make introductions. Vincent van Gogh is inspired by what he sees, and that's what you can see happening here. It's not so much the brushwork that's changed at this point. You can still see a kind of heavy buildup of paint, broad sweeping brush strokes, but it's the color, the turn towards color, the move away from blacks, whites, browns, and grays. And these two paintings, maybe if I showed these two out of context and without a title, you might even think that this painting, for example, on the right, is by Monet. And that makes perfect sense because, first of all, like the Impressionists, he's working out of doors. This is a landscape. So out of doors, plein air, it's a landscape. Also, you can see he's brightened, freshened his palette. And now even his brushwork has changed, little touches of the brush. And notice, for example, the way he's done the shading on the building up here instead of gray. It's little touches of different colors here. And of course, the subject matter, scenes of bourgeois recreation along the Seine River in the northern suburbs just outside of Paris, where Impressionism was born. This is a restaurant on the right facing the Seine River. I don't know if you can make out the name, but it's called the Restaurant of the Sirène, the Mermaid Restaurant. Again, the kind of subject matter that had enormous appeal for the Impressionists. Impressionism interested him, but something else he discovers in Paris that had an important impact on his development. This is a woman. She was a model, an artist model, an Italian woman. And Vincent van Gogh had a relationship with her. Vincent van Gogh actually ate in this cafe and paid his bills with paintings. And he also used the cafe, which was called the Tambourine Cafe. Notice the way the tables are painted here to look like tambourines. Drawing on his experience in Goupil, he organized art exhibits, and he organized 3 exhibits here. One, and that's what we can see vaguely on the walls here, of Japanese prints. 2, of the work of the Impressionists. 3, of the work of the Post-Impressionists, which we'll have a look at in a moment. Vincent van Gogh showed both with the Impressionists and the Post-Impressionists, that is the Pointillists, but they refused to show with each other. Anyway, here, Japanese prints. remember that Japan had only recently been open to the world. This was Admiral Perry's doing, and there was great interest in all things Japanese. And the market in Paris was flooded with Japanese pottery, fans, kimonos, and also contemporary 19th century Japanese woodblock prints. Vincent van Gogh, remember, had an incredible collection of prints from the Goupil Gallery. He had an incredible collection of illustrations from the London newspapers. And now he spent all he had purchasing Japanese prints and copying them. So you can see over, I'm starting over on the left. Here's the Japanese print, woodblock print. Here's Vincent van Gogh's copy. Japanese print, Vincent van Gogh's copy. And notice that there's a border in Vincent van Gogh's work that doesn't exist in the prints. That's because Vincent van Gogh used pre-stretched canvases and the format didn't quite correspond with the print that he was copying. So he just added the borders. And the calligraphy you see here means nothing. It's pure nonsense. It's just something he's picked up from looking at Japanese works. What did he like about these Japanese works? One, color, strong color, intense color. Two, a new idea about composition, a way to organize the different elements here. Now look at the cropping. Remember, this was something that influenced Cézanne as well. And it's very dramatic here. You have got something in the foreground that's cut off, and then you have a big leap into the background. Also typical of Japanese prints are to have this oblique angle, and this oblique angle creates a kind of flattening in terms of the space. Again, think of Cézanne. So this is a move away from traditional linear one-point perspective that's been around since the Renaissance. And I think for Vincent van Gogh, he also liked the kind of linear quality. These were woodblock prints and everything is kind of clearly outlined. That too, I think, appealed to him. And the subject matter, we have to say that the subjects of these Japanese prints jives nicely with the interests of the Impressionism. These are scenes of everyday life. In this case, so here's a Vincent van Gogh copy, this time after a Parisian magazine, which is after a print. And once again, he's added a border, things for him that seem Japanese, bamboo, lily pond with lily pads, a frog, cranes. And I think what interested Vincent van Gogh here is this pattern, the strong patterning. And when we look at this geisha, at least in this representation, we have no real idea about the body underneath this drapery. So again, there's this flatness and this interest in this kind of design. And now you can see Vincent van Gogh has taken a step away from the prints to do something more creative, not such a close copy. In the painting over on the left, he's used his collection of Japanese prints as a colorful backdrop for the sitter. So we were just looking at this one, for example. And this man, he ran an art store up in Paris. And this man would let Vincent van Gogh pay for art supplies with paintings. And in this way, this man named Father Tanguy developed an incredible collection of Van Gogh paintings. And by the way, this man did that only for one other artist, and that artist was Paul Cézanne. So it was in the shop of this man that Vincent van Gogh discovered the work of Cézanne that he greatly admired. Over on the right, you could he's still working with some of the Japanese ideas. Look at the flat gold background, the decorative border. In fact, the border kind of echoes the chair back here, which sort of finishes that idea. Look at the drapery, the interest in the pattern here, and the way this drapery is pulled up over her lap, but without giving us a sense of the knees and the lap. It's treated in a flat way, like we just saw in that geisha. By the way, this is the Italian model. Vincent van Gogh had her dress up in a traditional Italian costume because that to him seemed in keeping with the Japanese work that he admired, the traditional colorful costumes. And here's a third influence. Have I done my three? Impressionism, Japanese, and also I mentioned post-impressionism, particularly pointillism. This is this wonderful painting that's in the Chicago Art Institute that's enormous, made all of dots. And when Vincent van Gogh arrives in Paris in 1886, this is the painting that's on view in the last of the 8 exhibitions organized by the Impressionist artists. And Vincent van Gogh is excited by this, and look at how he responds. Okay, over on the left, a similar scene, a scene of a park. You can see his brushwork is smaller, more staccato. Also, like in the Seurat, instead of painting a tree all green, it's a mix of colors. So there's one of the ideas of the pointillists was, if you want to paint green, I'll just go back to this for a moment, instead of mixing blue and yellow on your palette, put down a dot of blue and a dot of yellow. And when you stand away from the painting, you have an effect called optical blending. The green you see is more intense because you've preserved the original integrity of these two colors rather than mixing it on the palette. So that's something that Vincent van Gogh's working with here. He's changed his brushwork. He's doing this kind of optical blending. But over here on the right, he starts to move away from pointillism, because I don't know if you've ever tried to do anything in this technique, but it's an incredible, painstaking technique. And Seurat said every square inch there had to be a certain amount of dots, certain number of dots. Vincent van Gogh had too much to do, and he couldn't be bothered with this. And he uses this mark-making technique in a different way than Seurat. He uses it to describe textures. Look at the texture of the shorn field here, the movement of the wind through the wheat. And then you can see he's varied his touch for the sky. This is one of my favorite self-portraits by Vincent van Gogh. It's a self-portrait he does in Paris, but he's now anticipating his trip south. And that's why he shows himself wearing a straw hat, because he imagined everybody in the south of France wore a straw hat to protect themselves from the strong sun of the south. It was also the idea of leaving the city behind and going to the country to commune with nature. Look at how he's used this mark-making technique here. Different again from Seurat. In the Seurat painting, it doesn't matter what he was painting, dog fur, grass, water, sails on a sailboat, it's all treated in the same way. But look here how these marks enliven the surface of the painting, how the marks snake up over the vest, radiate out around the head, the way they follow and turn around the brim of the hat. And on the face, well, it's almost like fur growth, that starts between the eyes and then fans out across the face. Vincent van Gogh comes south. He comes to Provence. He arrives in Arles in 1888 in the springtime. He gives as his reason for going south, he says, I went south to find Japan. Not because he had no notion of geography, but looking at the strong color in these prints, he thought, I don't have that in Paris. And remember the other day we talked about how Impressionism really is an art of the North, where you have to have a certain amount of moisture in the atmosphere for the effects that the Impressionists liked: fog, mist, haze. So Vincent van Gogh knew he couldn't go all the way to Japan. He couldn't afford it, but he thought the south of France will be as close as I can get. And there I'm going to find this kind of limpidity, a kind of clarity, bright colors and strong sun and countryside and nature, things that he admired in the prints. Here's another Japanese print that belonged to Van Gogh. And of course, when he arrives in the springtime in Provence, it's the time when all the orchards are coming into bloom. The first thing to bloom is the almond tree in the south here. And of course, he was immediately put in mind of almond trees and cherry trees that he admired in Japanese prints. And after the almond trees bloom in the south, then you have peach, pear, apple, cherry, everything else. And in fact, in his first 3 weeks, less than 3 weeks after his arrival, he does 14 paintings of the orchards coming into bloom. He's just the opposite of Cézanne. Remember that late bather painting I showed you, he worked on for 4 years. Vincent van Gogh, while he's in Provence, he's working at a rate of a painting every other day. So incredibly prolific. The painting on the right shows a drawbridge over a canal on the outskirts of Arles. Vincent van Gogh told Theo, his brother, in a letter, he described this work as being his most Japanese. And of course, what he's referring to is the strong colors, the way he's heightened, exaggerated the colors, the kind of neat outlines, like we mentioned, that you have in graphic prints, and even the subject matter. And over on the left, here's a photograph of what the bridge actually looks like today. He said to his brother, he said, I've just done a portrait of a mousme. And a mousme means it comes from the Japanese, and it's the French way of writing a Japanese word, which means young girl. And Vincent van Gogh had just been reading a book called Madame Chrysanthemum. And by the way, if you know Madame Butterfly or Madame Ségan, they're all based on this story. And after all, he'd gone to Provence to find Japan. So he tells his brother, I've just done a painting of a mousme, a Provençal Japanese girl. So the idea is to find an authentic native. And of course, she's Provençal, not Japanese, but he calls her La Mousme. And I love this portrait here of this girl. What I like are the way the buttons move down her bodice here, and how the bodice gives you a sense of the body underneath. And then look at the way the buttons then become part of the polka dots on the skirt. And the skirt is treated in a kind of flat way. I also like the way her arm follows and hand follow the arm of this traditional sort of Southern chair. And another portrait he does around the same time is of a man who became his best friend while he was in Arles, the postman, Joseph Rollin. And he paints a portrait of every single member, down to the newborn baby, of this man's family. And I think in this portrait, Vincent van Gogh was particularly interested in the postman's costume, this strong, lively, colorful costume with the gold buttons and the blue and the braid here. I suppose, like any northerner coming south, he was anxious to see the Mediterranean. And he takes one trip away from Arles in May after he arrives. He ends up in a little town traveling due south called Saint Marie la Mer, which means Saint Mary's of the Sea. According to legend, Mary Magdalene, Mary Salome, Mary the sister of the Virgin, accompanied by their servant Sarah, miraculously, after being chased out of the Holy Land, miraculously wash ashore in the south of France, where they preach, thus bringing Christianity to Provence, France, the rest of Europe. And don't forget Vincent van Gogh's religious background. So I think the subject here might have had special significance for him. He paints 4 boats representing the 4 figures. And we also see 4 boats in the water. And another interesting thing about this painting is, notice how once coming south, away from the influence of the Parisian schools of art, he opens up in terms of experimentation. Look at the way he's combined different techniques. Soft scumbling for the sky and the water, little dots to describe the texture of the sand. And for the boats, a different approach again. Heavy, bold outlines filled in with strong color like stained glass windows. This was a technique he called cloisonné, after that type of enamel work where the color is bound in. When Van Gogh returns to Arles, in the summer months, it was the period of the harvest. It was wheat they were harvesting then, as you can see in this painting, the wheat fields around Arles. Easy to pick out Arles in the distance because of its very distinctive towers. This is the City Hall Tower. This is the Gothic church. And these 2 low towers are watchtowers that were added on to the Roman amphitheater in the Middle Ages. And notice also how he hasn't shied away from signs of encroaching industrialization on the landscape. He's got the train and the factory smokestacks. And if you were wondering why it was that he ended up in Arles and not Aix, given that he was interested in Cézanne, well, when they built the railway, it went from north to south, from Paris to Marseille, bypassing Aix with a stop in Arles. So it's possible he got off and thought about making a connection and traveling on to Aix, but he never did. He became so excited by things he found to paint in Arles. And in any case, we know he felt he had arrived because he tells Theo, he says, I understand Cézanne better now because I'm in Provence. Again, after the harvest of the wheat, here is the sower. So he's using the sower from the French artist Millet in this painting. Look at the way he's exaggerated the sun here and the light moving from the sun with the rays here. And in that painting and in this painting, notice the color. Suddenly we've got this bold, vibrant, strong color. Vincent van Gogh's revelation while he's in the South is, as we mentioned the other day, not in terms of form like it was for Cézanne, but remember, Van Gogh's a northerner, so coming to Provence was for him like us going to Tahiti today. This was something exotic, and he treats it as such. And his idea is, in order to capture, to talk about the kind of luminosity that he encounters in the South, instead of using black and white, again, think of Rembrandt, he thinks, I'm going to work with opposite color combinations. And they are blue and orange, yellow and violet, red and green. And the idea is when you put opposite colors next to each other, they take on something in intensity. They vibrate next to each other. So this was his revelation, and you can see he's using that color combination in this painting here. We have sort of oranges and yellows for the figure, and then kind of dark midnight sky, blue and purples. This was a Belgian artist. Vincent van Gogh met him. He worked in a town near Arles. Vincent van Gogh liked him and liked this man's work. And he tells Theo, he says, I want to do this man's portrait. I want to put my admiration for this man and his work in my portrait of him. I want to immortalize him, make him a star. And you can see he's done that literally. He's set the man aglow. Look, there's even a kind of halo here, like a star against a, as we said, midnight sky. You see that same kind of color combination here. And by the way, these colors, sort of blue and orange, were his own colors. He had this kind of carrot colored hair and very blue eyes. This is a nighttime scene, so he's using this color combination to talk about the night sky. So convinced was he that there was a whole range of colors to capture at night that he would go out with candles tucked under the ribbon which ran around his hat. And as you can imagine, this didn't help his reputation with the locals, who were very suspicious of this stranger in their midst. This is a painting of a cafe on one of the main squares. So artificial lighting here. I like the way the light hits the tabletops and echoes something of the movement of the stars in the sky above. This is also from his nighttime series, except this is a painting showing an interior night scene rather than an exterior night scene, called The Night Cafe. Vincent van Gogh explained to Theo, a night cafe is a generic term. This is a kind of cafe that stays open all night. So if you don't have enough money for a hotel, you're too drunk to go home, you can spend the night here. And he adds, this is also a place where you can go mad, commit crimes. And he explains he expressed that idea through a different color combination, this time red and green, which for him represented clash and contrast. And I'm always struck, I wonder if you'll agree with me here, when I see this painting, it puts me in mind of the potato eaters. Because once again, we have figures grouped around a table, and we have this incredible emphasis on the light source. From the night series, this is Starry Night over the Rhone, again at Arles. And we see in the sky a constellation. This is the Big Dipper. And the stars are reflected in the sky, as is the gas lighting, which was new in Arles at this time. Okay, once again, a kind of blue-yellow or blue-orange combination, a blue-yellow-orange combination, so that combination of opposite colors. He's using here in his painting of the Yellow House. This is where he lived, where he worked. It was his studio, his gallery. And for him, it was the site, the location of an association of artists. His idea was these artists would live and work together here to advance the cause of art, to develop a kind of new, radical, avant-garde art. In this painting, you can see the train. So he found accommodation right near the train station. If you go to Arles, you will not see the Yellow House because it no longer exists. It was destroyed during World War II. They weren't aiming for it. They were aiming for the bridge over the Rhone River, which was just nearby, but this went at the same time. This building is gone, but all these buildings and the train bridge still exist. And I'm interested in how Vincent van Gogh focused our attention on just that part of the yellow house he lived and worked in, this part with the green doors and shutters. And notice how that he's pushed, the block isn't parallel to the picture plane, but he's pushed that part out towards us, and how even the road work is interrupted just here to focus our attention on that part of the building. There's something about the coloring here that often puts me in mind of Magritte. You know, he was the surrealist painter who often did like the buildings in a daylight and then the sky in a kind of nighttime light. Maybe some of you thought of the bedroom when I asked you if certain paintings come to mind immediately. Well, here it is. This is his bedroom from the yellow house, inside the yellow house. Notice the color combinations here, different sets of colors. And speaking of sets, look at all the pairings, sets of two. There are two doors here, two chairs, two pillows on the bed, two sets of paintings, two brushes on the table, two bottles on the table. Psychologists talk about the fact that Vincent van Gogh is what's called a replacement child. He was born 1 year to the day after a first child born to his parents named Vincent, who died. One idea is that his mother was still in mourning when he was born, and he gets the idea in his head that it was the first son that his mother loved, and the pairing explained as a desire to kind of merge with this long-lost brother as a way of regaining his mother's attention and love. It might simply have had to do with the fact that he was lonely in Arles, and he was interested in creating this community of artists and anticipating the arrival of fellow artist Paul Gauguin. And before Gauguin arrives, he does the series of sunflower paintings. These were done to welcome Gauguin. And here's how Vincent van Gogh thought about color. He thought yellow. Yellow is the color of sun. Therefore, yellow is the color of warmth. Therefore, yellow is the color of light and friendship. So these work to welcome Gauguin. Notice how the painting is almost all in yellows. And also notice how the heads of the flowers are at different stages of fading, which gives the painting a certain poetry. Well, Gauguin arrives in October 1888. And at first, it seems like the two artists are getting along fine. And I say seems like because we have a hard time piecing together the story, because for this interval, Vincent stops writing his brother Theo. So we try to piece together the story by looking at their paintings. And here they've both painted the same thing. They've painted one of the, this is a woman that ran one of the cafes where they took their meals, Madame Ginou, and she's shown here in her traditional Arlesian costume. The beauty of the local women in this traditional dress was legendary and might have been another reason why both Van Gogh and Gauguin were drawn to Arles. So here's Van Gogh's version, and then you can see Paul Gauguin, whose version is actually based on Van Gogh's painting. And notice he set the figure in Vincent van Gogh's night cafe. Then both artists take their easels and equipment and set up in an ancient cemetery just outside of Arles. When I say ancient, these are Roman sarcophagi you're looking at the base of the trees. This was a Roman necropolis. And I have Van Gogh's painting and Gauguin's, so you can compare. And I'm wondering if they strike you as being different. At first glance, they're similar because the colors are bright. But look again, in Van Gogh, there's something sort of sinister about the green sky, and the trees are like flames, and we have the factory smokestacks. This is part of the railroad works. And there's a heavy buildup of paint here, so it's kind of a handwriting that calls out for attention. In Gauguin's, it's much more picturesque, more tranquil. He's eliminated the factory smokestacks, and the brushwork is small and tiny, and the emphasis seems to be here on a kind of overall patterning, something sort of decorative. Well, trouble between the two artists starts when Gauguin tries to convince Van Gogh to work in a way that he's not used to doing. Gauguin says, "Don't paint what you can see in front of you." In fact, his famous line is, "When you're outside in the landscape, close your eyes, have a dream about that landscape, and paint that." So you can see that that's what Gauguin's done here. It's a very sort of strange landscape where the perspective is very strange. And we see the figures in their Arlesian costume. And if you look closely at the bush, you can see a self-portrait of Gauguin. This is Vincent van Gogh's attempt to work from his head, from his imagination, drawing from memory. Look what he's come up with. The diagonal crop tree of the Japanese prince, Millet's figure of the sower, and this time with the sun behind his head like an enormous halo. Gauguin's portrait of Vincent painting sunflowers. Gauguin loved the sunflower paintings, but Vincent wasn't too happy with this portrait that Gauguin had done of him. In fact, there's no way that Vincent was actually painting sunflowers when Gauguin did this painting, because it was the wrong time of year. And we see here a kind of made-up background, maybe even one of Gauguin's paintings hung as a backdrop. Vincent van Gogh's comment about this painting was, "It's me, all right, but me gone mad," is what he said. And here is Van Gogh's portrait of Gauguin. Look at the painting on the right. Clearly, he didn't feel up to having Gauguin pose. That might have been too intimidating. So instead, what he does is he paints Van Gogh's chair. So it's sort of like that painting of the shoes we saw earlier. It's a painting that's sort of between still life and portraiture. And then he does his own self-portrait as chair. And notice the difference between these two. Here is a comfortable armchair on a richly tapestried rug. On the chair, books and a lit candle representing kind of learning. Vincent van Gogh's chair is a simple rustic chair on a simple rustic floor, only his pipe and tobacco. He signs his name on a crate of spouting onions. And the other way you might describe these is, this is Gauguin is a nighttime scene, and Vincent's is a daytime scene. And Vincent might have been suggesting that he's concerned with things of this world, things you can see, nature. Whereas Gauguin, nighttime scene, he's concerned with the world of dreams and the imagination. So I have to say it, but it seems as if Van Gogh is saying the difference between them is like night and day. Well, this doesn't end well, as I'm sure you know. Vincent van Gogh cuts off his ear. Gauguin, terrified, leaves town, never to return again, taking with him Vincent van Gogh's dream of this utopian community of artists. Van Gogh ends up in the hospital in Arles, where he does this painting of the hospital courtyard. On the right, you can see a photograph of what the garden looks like today. They replanted it according to descriptions in Vincent's letters to Theo. It's not a hospital today, it's a kind of cultural foundation. This self-portrait Vincent van Gogh did for his doctor. He shows himself in a calmer mood. meditatively puffing away on his pipe. He hasn't tried to hide his wound ear, his bandaged ear. And this was actually Vincent van Gogh's way of explaining to his doctor his ideas about art. So notice what he's done. Divided the canvas roughly in half with one set of opposite colors on the top, orange and blue, and another set, red and green, on the bottom. Divided just at eye level with all those colors represented in the eyes. Well, because he was painting at night and because he cut off his ear, the citizens of Arles circulated a petition saying, "We will not have this man on the loose in our town, so he can't stay." He's even lost the support of his best friend, the postman Roulin, who's been transferred to Marseille. So it's decided that Vincent van Gogh will go to the nearby asylum in just outside of a village called Saint-Remy. And he goes on a voluntary basis. He says, I need a year to get myself together. And that's exactly what happens. He's there from May 1889 until May 1890. The shadowy figure in the doorway here with the straw hat, we take to be a self-portrait. And this figure here, his doctor. His doctor's diagnosis was epilepsy, still one that's accepted today, although there are many other ideas: schizophrenia, inner ear disorder, bipolar. I don't think we'll ever really know for certain. No real treatment here apart from a kind of water therapy. And when Vincent van Gogh left, the doctor wrote in his ledger, "Cured." A self-portrait he does while he's at the asylum. Look at the movement in this painting. This is a self-portrait he does soon after having had a bad spell. And Vincent van Gogh worked when he could. He sometimes had bad spells which would last several weeks. And during these periods, he would do things like eat his paints. Afterwards, he'd have no recollection as to what had transpired, but he also had periods of lucidity, and that's when he worked. And at these times, he worked on a series of landscape views he entitled Impressions of Provence. There were certain features in the landscape which for him were typically Provençal. And we have them all in this painting. They included the cypress tree, which he compared to an Egyptian obelisk in one of his letters, the olive tree, and he must have been thinking about Cézanne and his mountain. And after all, he comes from Holland where it's flat. The mountain, this time the Alpi, the little Alps that are situated between Arles and Saint-Remy. But it was particularly the olive tree that captured his attention. And he did many paintings of the olive groves which surrounded the asylum. Again, you see the movement here, typical of this work in this period, almost like a reflection of his own inner turmoil. I think he might have identified with the olive tree, twisted and gnarly, which worked hard to sink its roots into this stony soil and produce this little fruit. You might be familiar with the iris, painting of irises, which he did while he was at the asylum. He did many paintings of the courtyards at the asylum. So here's one over on the left. He identified with this tree. He tells Theo the tree had been struck by lightning, and so they had to cut part of it down. And of course, he made the connection with that was something that happened to him. When he cut off his ear, it was like it had been struck by lightning and also diminished by losing his ear. Theo arranges for him to have two rooms. One he works in and the other he lives in. This is a drawing for Theo to show him what his studio room looked like. Notice the bars on the window. And when he felt like he couldn't go outside to work, that seemed too much for him, he would often paint the view from the window minus the bars. And here we see not the sower this time, but the reaper. And Vincent van Gogh said the reaper, of course, is the flip side to the sower. But he added, there's nothing sad in this, because after all, what's he doing? He's cutting down the wheat, which will be turned into bread, which is food. So it's kind of an inch to ensure this whole cycle of life and death. And it's at this point he paints Starry Night, a famous work for which there are many different interpretations. We see here a kind of apocalyptic vision, the cypress tree now like a flame connecting the terrestrial and celestial realms. And look at all the movement in the sky. I sometimes wonder if this isn't his interpretation of the Mistral, the very strong wind we have down here in the south. He himself said of the painting, it's a synthetic work, combining both impressions of Provence with memories of the North. And there does seem to be something sort of more northern than southern about this church. So he's returning a little bit to Gauguin's idea. Anyway, he was homesick and wanted to return north, and he does so soon. And one more type of work that he produces while he's at the asylum, when he couldn't face working in the garden or painting the landscape through the window, he would ask Theo, like he had done at the beginning of his career, to send him prints after Millet. And he called these paintings he did based on these black and white reproductions translations, because he translated them in terms of color combinations. Here's a Rembrandt. Notice he's only taken this one, this part of the painting or part of the print to reproduce. And I can't help but feeling this is Vincent van Gogh himself here with the red beard and hair, hoping to be resurrected like Lazarus. And remember, I've just got a couple more slides for you. I know I'm running a little bit late. Everybody okay? I'll finish up. Remember the almond trees he paints when he first arrives in Provence. He's returned to that subject here, except now we have just the branches silhouetted against the sky, created this kind of all over patterning, very much like a Japanese print. This painting he intended as a gift for his nephew. His brother Theo has in the meantime married, and they've had a son, Theo's wife, Jo, and Theo have had a son whom they named Vincent after our Vincent. And our Vincent, anxious to meet his namesake, decides to leave the South and return to the North. He arrives at a bad time. The baby's been ill, the mother's exhausted, Theo's thinking of quitting his job. And don't forget, Theo has been supporting Vincent all this time. Plus the commotion of Paris, where his brother was, after the isolation of Saint-Remy, just too much for him. His brother arranges for him to stay in a little village outside of Paris, Auvers, where he dies, under the watchful eye of this man, Dr. Gachet. This man had a kind of eclectic practice, a mix of homeopathic and botanical medicine. His specialty was nervous disorders, and that's why he's shown here holding foxglove, which was a source for an ingredient in the treatment of nervous disorders. Notice he looks a lot like Vincent van Gogh. In fact, Vincent van Gogh said of him, "I'm not sure we can trust him. I think he's sicker and crazier than I am." Remember the church, the view of the Father's church, where we saw all the people coming in or going out of the church. Now we just have a single figure on a road that sort of moves around the church without any obvious entrance into it. And I've got my last two slides. This is one of his very last paintings, Wheat Field with Crows. He describes this painting as showing vast wheat fields. He says it's an expression of sadness, of loneliness. A lot of questions about this painting. The fact that there are 3 roads, is that significant? This road seems to dead end, or does it just turn and disappear? Those crows, are they flying towards us or away from us? Sound like static interference on the horizon line. And here's my last slide for you. I put this in because they've now decided that this was Vincent van Gogh's very last painting, because someone doing research has actually located the site. So here's an old postcard, and you can see they've just photoshopped on the painting, and it matches perfectly. This is in Auvers. Well, you probably know the end of this story, but Vincent van Gogh, one day while he was working in the fields around Auvers, much like he had done in Arles, he took a gun with him, shoots himself in the chest. The bullet bounces off his rib cage. He's managed to walk back to the inn where he's staying. Theo, summoned, arrives the next day, and Vincent dies the day after that. Theo dies 6 months later, and then 2 of them are now buried side by side in the cemetery in this little village called Auvers. Well, I know that's kind of a sad note to end on. Let me come out of my slide presentation to see if there's any questions in the chat. And also feel free to unmute and ask me questions directly. That's always fun for me to be able to talk to you directly. Here we go. I don't see any questions in the chat. So if anybody has a question, would you feel free to unmute?
Hi, I'm wondering, in that period towards the end when Cézanne visited Van Gogh.
You mean Gauguin?
Gauguin, sorry, visited Van Gogh. Do you think they were intentionally painting the same things to sort of study them, or whether this was competitive? And if you paint a chair, I'm painting a chair, kind of.
Yeah, well, let me clarify that the 2 chairs were both done by Van Gogh.
Yeah, but I just use that as an example.
Okay, but I think you're right on both counts, because Vincent van Gogh and Gauguin exchanged paintings before they actually worked together in Arles. So they appreciated each other's work, and both of them, decided that Impressionism is old hat. Both of them were interested in creating a new art form, something that even went beyond pointillism, for example. So they had that idea together. But I think while they were working, there was definitely competition. These were both strong personalities. And here they are, stuck together in Arles, which was a little sort of backwoodsy place almost. And we know that when Vincent van Gogh cut off his ear, it was after like a week or maybe even longer period of rain, and the idea of these 2 guys stuck in the yellow house, and they were competitive. I think Vincent van Gogh, at first, he was saying, in my new studio, the South, my dream of this art colony, Gauguin's going to be the leader. But then he bristled at some of Gauguin's suggestions, like working from his imagination and working from memory. And Gauguin later took credit. He said, when I came across Van Gogh in Arles, he was floundering, and I set him on the right path. And of course, this is said after Vincent van Gogh's work has received a lot of attention, has become very popular, and started to sell. So there was certainly competition. And Vincent van Gogh writes in his letters, he said, "Oh, we've had a fight in I feel like I've got an electrical storm going on in my head." And that's, of course, this is all led up to the ear incident. So I hope I answered your question. Yeah, go ahead.
I was looking at the
Not
painting
showing forward.
following
I've never had that.
that brief period of in which he toyed with pointillism. He wasn't doing pointillist paintings, but he was doing elongated dots. He sort of adapted a pointillism to a style that he was developing. And
That's
I
right.
also noticed that as that period progressed, and I don't remember the particular paintings that characterized it, much of his painting became more primitive. It was less. It was not only less realist. It was also, it seems to me, more purposely, I don't know, immature. And
Yeah.
is that just a completely false impression that I have?
No,
or-
Stephen, you always ask great questions like you did last time on Cesar, and you're absolutely right. And one of the things that what first came to my mind is two things. Let's see. So one is a line of Vincent van Gogh's was, in painting, what you should do is exaggerate the essential and leave the obvious vague. So he wasn't interested in, like Cézanne, in giving us a lot of information. And it does have a more primitive look. And he said, for example, about his portraiture, and this refers to the Aro period, he said, a painted portrait can do so much more than a photographic portrait. A photographic portrait is just a, superficial physical resemblance. In a painted portrait, you've got something of the soul. And at another place, he talked about he wanted to have, like in the Potato Eaters, it's purposeful that to give his look, he said, to give my work the look of homespun. He didn't want it to look like a fabricated thing, like a product of the Industrial Revolution, like a photograph. He wanted, in fact, in the backgrounds, you can see, even though it's like a single color, if you look closely, it looks like basket weave. So that was something deliberate on his part, to give it this look of homespun, like a handcrafted element. So you're right in seeing it that way. And Gauguin, in a different way, is also doing that. Of course, where does Gauguin end up? Tahiti. So he really is into this idea about the primitive and paring down to essences and figures. It's no longer about anatomy, proportions, perspective, modeling. It takes on that modern look. It's flat, and also the color's expressive. Yeah, so I hope I answered your question.
Yes, thank you.
Nancy?
Yes, was one of the pieces of art by Van Gogh that you showed us, Pamela, was, you said, notice he uses 3 different techniques. I think it might have been the sailboats. I'm not positive, but I wondered, was he unique during that time as an artist, using different techniques, versus just pointillism or...
Yes. And to go back to something that Stephen said, you're right that he's unhappy with pointillism because it makes you crazy painting that way. And Vincent van Gogh didn't have the time or the patience to do this dot, 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 dot. So he uses dots in an expressive way. He finds a way to use them, but in a very different way. And oops, now wait a minute, you just asked me about, the sailboat painting. Yes, I would say his work is absolutely unique. When we say post-impressionism, we're talking, maybe I said this when I was talking about Cézanne, but we're talking about a group of artists that include Cézanne, Toulouse-Lautrec, Gauguin, Seurat of the little dots, and Van Gogh. And if you think about them, they're all doing very different things. Van Gogh's work is unique. And this is maybe also a way of explaining why Theo wasn't able to sell his work. The deal between the two, Theo supported Vincent. Vincent thought everything I produce belongs to my brother. He sends it up to Paris so Theo could market it in the gallery. Theo, it wasn't his fault. Theo wasn't allowed to show the work of the Impressionists unless somebody asked to see it. The owner of the gallery told him, I don't want any Impressionist painting to be visible through the window from the street. And when you think that Vincent van Gogh's painting goes so much beyond Impressionism, that's why he wasn't able to sell the work. It's unique at this time.
Was he unique in using different techniques within the same painting? Because there was one, and I thought it was the sailboats, and you said, notice, he uses this here, and then he does this here, and was that unique?
Yeah, I think so. I think a lot of let's see, I think even Gauguin, maybe, they all go through a kind of transitional period, and that's true for Gauguin too. And when I say, and post-impressionism makes sense if you think they all start off with impressionism. So there is a kind of transitional moment where they are open to experimentation. But I can't think of another example like Van Gogh's painting of the sailboats, where you've got three really obvious different approaches combined in one painting.
Thank you.
Sure.
Pamela, there's a question in the chat box. Ted asks, in your last lecture, you mentioned that Picasso was influenced by Cézanne, Van Gogh, and Matisse. Can you explain how and show the parallels between those artists?
Yes. Well, next Thursday, of course, we'll talk about Matisse. And so I believe I'll be able to show you quite clearly how he was influenced by Cézanne and Van Gogh. They were key. In fact, Cézanne and Van Gogh are key for everything that happens in 20th century art. They're key for Matisse. We'll talk about this more, but Matisse was the leader of a movement called Fauvism. And Fauvism is all about expressive use of brushwork and color. That comes from Van Gogh. Picasso is all about, it's Cubism. Cubism and Fauvism are the two movements at the beginning of the 20th century. And Cubism, as we saw last time, comes directly out of Cézanne. So everybody builds on these two. These two artists are key for everybody else that comes afterwards. And for example, Matisse and Picasso both refer to Cézanne as the father of us all. So, it's because they said about Cézanne. And I would say that it's interesting, and that's why I like to talk about Cézanne and Van Gogh, because in a way you can see that Matisse is a modern Van Gogh and Picasso is a modern Cézanne. In other words, they take what those two were doing another step. And I've been trying to break this down as a way for you to get an easy handle on this. As Van Gogh in terms of color, well, Matisse is known as the great colorist of the 20th century. So he builds on Van Gogh. And like Van Gogh, he comes from the north. And when he comes to the south, he's just blown away by the light, by the colors, by the vegetation, exactly like Van Gogh. Picasso, like Cézanne, is from the south. He's born in Malaga along the Mediterranean. So this is part of his identity, this kind of classicism of the South, that's part of his roots. So you can see that whereas form was of interest to Cézanne, for Picasso, it's also form. And, their art is about sort of sculptural concerns in a way. That's what is one way of talking about Cubism. Does that work?
Monica has a question.
Actually, it's more of a comment, and I was late getting here, so maybe you already mentioned it, but there was a fabulous article in the New Yorker recently about Jo Van Gogh.
Absolutely.
And how and I thought maybe others would find it interesting, how first Vincent died and left everything he owned to Theo, and then Theo died 6 months later, and there is Jo with a baby and this incredible wealth of art, and she has to figure out how to dispose of it, how to sell it, to put it in museums. And I thought
Yeah.
it was just so interesting.
Absolutely. I'm so glad you mentioned that because it's true. I don't know if you can, it was in the last month, I think,
Yeah,
this article in the New York Times about her nickname was Jo. So this is Theo's wife. And that's right. They had a child named Vincent. And it's an incredible story. And in fact, what we know of Van Gogh today is thanks to Jo. Really, it is. Because she made sure all the letters were translated, were put in order. There were no dates on them. She also had the smart idea of selling not only Van Gogh's work, but his life. You know, when we think of an artist today, the stereotype is Vincent van Gogh, the sort of tormented, crazy artist. That all comes from Van Gogh, and she promoted not only his work but his life through his letters as well, and made that part of the package. And that's where that comes from. But it's a wonderful story. So if you can get a hold of that New York Times article, also if you're for further interest, you know, the Van Gogh Museum in Amsterdam, because that's where the core of the collection went. It went from Jo to the nephew Vincent, and that nephew became an engineer, and he was responsible for creating the Van Gogh Museum in Amsterdam. And they have a really nice website, and they do talk about Jo, not to the same extent the New York Times article did, but I think you'll find some information there about her.
Pamela, I have a
question. Patty.
I always heard that when he cut his ear, it wasn't his whole ear, it was just the end of it. And it was because he was having an affair with a woman and she shunned him. And in fact, because of Arles, the location of Arles, where they do have bullfights, and the toreador cuts the ear off of the bull and hands it to the woman of his choice in the stands. So I always heard that that's really, he was so frustrated, you know, sexually, but he didn't, you know, he had these ideas of going after certain women and was shunned. And this was a response to that, I guess, loneliness, or just wanting to be getting the attention of this one particular lady he had in mind.
That's absolutely right. You know, there are lots of different ways to interpret the ear incident. And I, of course, mentioned the tension between the two artists as certainly part of that. And you're right that the two of them attended bullfights in Arles. And that's right. In a successful bullfight, they cut off the ear of the bull and presented to a lady in the crowd. And that's just what Vincent van Gogh did. You're also right. There was a whole series of unhappy love affairs. We now know that he cut off his entire ear. And you might be interested in this. There's a book called, I think it's called Van Gogh's Ear. But it's written by an art historian from X. And it reads like a detective story because she was always curious. Did he cut off part of his ear or all of his ear? And she actually tracked down the doctor's drawing, which shows he sliced off his whole ear. And you know where the drawing was? In the archives at UC Berkeley that belonged to Irving Stone, who did the film Lust for Life with Kirk Douglas. And he had come to Arles to do research, and that was part of his archives, and it was in California, and she found it. And another reason to read her book is not only because of that story, but she does a wonderful job of recreating the atmosphere of Arles in that period in the 19th century. And the standard story is that Vincent van Gogh took his ear to a prostitute. And we do know that Gauguin and Van Gogh they referred to this activity as their weekly hygienics. They would visit prostitutes. And the standard story is he took it to a prostitute in one of the brothels where, again, maybe there was some kind of competition between him and Gauguin. But there's also an idea that this woman was, the particular woman he gave his ear to, was a woman who worked there, not a prostitute, and a woman that he possibly met in Paris before coming down, and may have been another reason why he was interested in coming down to Arles. And of course, in Paris, she stood out. She'd actually been bitten by a dog, and there was a new treatment for rabies that was brand new. And she traveled to Paris in her traditional Arlesian costume, which nobody wore in Paris. And Vincent van Gogh met her. And anyway, so we don't know. I don't think it's any one of these things, but we do know that now he cut off his whole ear.
Okay. I was thinking about the strokes that Stephen was questioning a few moments ago.
Me
Jump
too.
off his idea. I kept thinking, being a painter myself, yesterday I went out with a group of people, we do plein air painting, and we all look at the same spot and we all paint differently. It's just amazing to me that even though one might have black and white, charcoal, or one might be using oil or acrylics or a watercolor, but there's no competition with us. It's just the enjoyment of being there and enjoying the day painting, and the safety of it also, in numbers. But also we love looking at each other's work, but it's nothing like what it sounds like these two men had in their relationship, of that jealousy or concerns that he won't listen to me and I won't listen to him and I'm going to do my own thing. So it's interesting, but those strokes that Stephen was talking about, I was thinking he only had 10 years of being a painter. He had so much energy. So those little dots that Seurat did were just too inconvenient for a painter like Van Gogh, who would slash down. He had that energy coming out. He wouldn't have time to do those meticulous spots. He would push them down and as fast as he could go. So I thought that was, I like Stephen's idea of noticing that.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I agree with you. That he was a live wire. He had all this energy. Think of the rate at which he was producing these things.
Exactly. 10 years. Amazing. How many paintings did he actually do? 400?
No, more than that. Total production is something like 2,000. I want to say 2,000, but you better double check me. But I know that total production for Cézanne is about 800 paintings. And of course, he lived much longer than Vincent van Gogh. But I'm not sure if that takes in drawings or not. You'll have to double check, because I'm not sure. But we do know that while he's those 2 years in Provence, it's a rate of a painting every 2 days.
I believe it. There were days when I was off painting, I would do 4 in a day. 4. I have them hanging right here in my bathroom. Seriously.
Yeah.
I came back. Alan said to me, count how many pieces you have, Patty, before you go back to the States. Include the drawings from the Beaux-Arts and everything. I had 400 pieces.
Wow.
Yeah, myself. Yeah. So I know there were days where I felt like Vincent van Gogh.
Yeah, right. Although, do remember that, again, here's another big switch from the way that painters had been working. The idea was you'd spend years and years on a single painting, because of course it had to be meticulous. It had to have this, you had to work it up into this kind of high gloss, this kind of polish. And so this is what, it starts with Impressionism, but there's a break with the traditional way of working.
Mm-hmm. But thanks again. It was excellent, Pamela. Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Yes, thank you. It's getting late there in France, so I think we need to.
It's almost
done. I want to thank you very much, Pamela, and I want to thank everyone for joining us. We'll see you next week from Matisse.
Absolutely. Okay, great. Thank you, everybody.
Enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank
Au
you.
revoir.
Au revoir, madame.
À jeudi prochain.
D'accord. Oui.